So without further ado, Dan, I will hand over to you.
My name's Dan Lowe's. I want to talk to you today about the art of debriefing and talk you through some methods in which I was exposed to it in a high performance team and over a 17-year career with the Royal Air Force. So that's me. I joined the Air Force at 19. I spent 17 years flying frontline aircraft, the Typhoon that you can see on the left, and the Hawk fighter aircraft that you can see on the right. In the capacity of the Hawk aircraft, it was with the Red Arrows. And with the Typhoon, I spent 17 years deploying around the world on operational commitments, whether that be the Middle East, North America, Southeast Asia, or into Africa, or indeed actually down to the Falkland Islands. From that, I was selected to go to what we call our Qualified Weapons Instructor course, which to you and I, to Hollywood, and to people outside the military would see as Top Gun, which I graduated, became a Top Gun instructor, before very, very luckily, and through a bit of hard work, I was selected to be a Red Arrows pilot and joined the Royal Air Force Aerobatic Team, which not only represents the Royal Air Force, the armed forces in general, but also all around the world for the United Kingdom. And in that time, I displayed in over 27 countries, and our biggest show culminated in 2.5 million people on the beaches of California. I flew as number 3, number 5, and number 9. And as number 9, I also was backed up as the executive officer of the team. So what does that mean to you? That means that I was intrinsically in line with the debriefing system of the Red Arrows. And it's what I want to talk to you today, because debriefing is what I did. I'd just like to take a moment to take that in. Why do I care about debriefing? There's a picture of me chasing down another enemy fighter, albeit for training purposes in the Welsh valleys. And if ever you've been walking up there, you will see the jets walking or flying, sorry, below the walking line. Now, I just want you to take a moment to imagine the fact that you've been on a frontline squadron for about 3-4 years. That means you've been a member of your team for that amount of time. You know exactly what it is you're supposed to be doing. Now, what I want you to do is, out of 136 people, you've been selected for that Qualified Weapons Instructor course. Again, as I mentioned, Top Gun. And you've been given a budget to take aircraft to North America, to the Nevada desert, and pitch yourself against 150 pilots from the best air forces all around the world in a huge exercise called Exercise Red Flag, which is a big war game. Now, why is that important, you say? Well, actually, they've taken historical data since the Korean War, and they've worked out that most fighter pilots were shot down or killed in their first 10 missions. And what they've done is they've created this huge war game, and it simulates as lifelike as possible the stresses, strains, and the confusion, and they create the fog of war that I'm sure you've all heard about before. And scientifically proven off the back of that exercise, fighter pilots, young fighter pilots, are able to survive their first 10 missions once they're actually exposed to real life conflict. Now, I'd like you just to add a scenario to that initial picture. You're there, you're strapped to that aircraft, you're by yourself. It's pitch black. There's 90 other aircraft in a small bit of airspace above you. They're shouting and screaming on the radios. Not only is that airspace absolutely jam-packed full of aircraft, it's being pumped full of electronic waves. Now, what does that mean? That means that my radar signal is picking up false targets. Where the enemy are and where they aren't, I can't depict. However, I'm locked onto a target. My missile has told me that it's got the right target, and I'm being told through my ear to take the shot. Now, in that moment, running out of fuel and panicked, I take that shot. Now, I'm not impressed to tell you the result, but that simulated missile went screaming through the sky at twice the speed of sound. And moments later, 2 of my teammates would have been in the parachutes descending into enemy hands in some far-flung deserts, as my missile had just slammed into the side of a friendly airplane. Now, I want you to think of that as we go through why I care about debriefing. What is a debrief to you? What is it you think you need to take from a debrief, and why do you think the debrief is important? That's why it's important to me. For me, it's that vehicle in which you can break down a performance and work out what truly happened. It's a way in which we can sit back, rewind all the events, and start to depict and realign exactly what we tried to achieve versus what we actually did. Where I come from, there's absolutely no point in doing a second event unless you spent time trying to improve the first one. And this is that vehicle in which you can do that. If you've got full team buy-in and everyone understands exactly why it broke down, then you will have an effective way that you can implement change within your team. We can all listen to how people used to do things. We can all listen to how people have these great ideas about how we should do it next time. But unless we can align that with our values and our goals and our aims, there is no way that you can effectively implement change without getting your team to debrief how they're performing up to date. Another thing, it's easy to look at the entirety of the task that you set out to achieve and talk about it in its totality, which is far too much for most of us to even take in. I could sit here and talk about the intricacies of the accounting side of a business and the lawyers won't listen. Or I might get into the law side of it when we're trying to finish off a big deal and the accountants will switch off. What we need to do, we need to break it down into smaller chunks, either vignettes or chapters, and then we can take chapter 1, 4, and 8, and we can then really start to tinker with the tiny little bits that will affect the change. I hope some of you play golf. I'm sure not all of you do, but if you do watch it, or if you've heard of it, you will see that top players will just fall off the tour for sometimes months, if not years at a time, because they've changed their swing, because they think that will change their game. Well, actually, was it that, or did they just need to implement a different power into their stroke? Did they need to just change their grip ever so slightly? And so by having a debrief, you can break it down into smaller chunks and just start to tweak tiny bits in order to get a greater result. And finally, that learning is a change of behavior. If you are setting the standards and if you are creating those debriefing cultures in your working environment and in your teams, when you have new members join, whether they're experienced because they've joined you from other top businesses, or if they're your apprentices that you're bringing through, that you're investing in being the future of your company, if you're instilling that behavior in them from the very start, then that will grow with the company. The culture of debrief will grow, and the idea that learning is the way forward, and that failure is not to be frightened of, then your experience will continue to grow and your company and your ideas will flourish. Now, if you were to go to an air show on the South Coast and watch the red arrows display, if you saw that particular maneuver, I can't imagine many of you will be impressed. Now, what's happened there, that's actually in North State of New York. We've pulled up into a loop. We're supposed to be doing a bomb burst. It's supposed to be a beautiful day. But as we've pulled up, as we know, the clouds change very quickly and we've all gone into clouds. Now, traveling at 450 miles an hour, 7 to 11 feet off each other's wing, flying into thick fog essentially is not the place you want to be. And what you have there, a result of every individual conducting a maneuver in order to safely break away from each other. Now, it looks very close, and I can tell you it is. But if you can imagine a roundabout and you're very close to another car, as you pull off that roundabout, you're going to separate from them very quickly. And that's what you can see happening there. That is not what we set out to achieve. What we wanted to look like was that. What we want to be known for is that. That's our corporate identity, not falling out of clouds and random patterns. So how is it we can take that moment? How can we learn from that? And how can we make sure that when we fly over 1 million people on the 10th of July in 2018, as you can see in that picture, over the streets of the Mall, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Royal Air Force in front of the Queen, that we're known as the best team in the world. Oh, sorry, Sarah. We do it via the debrief. I do apologize. There we go. There's a slight delay here. Sorry, I'm speaking to you from Cape Town, so there's a slight delay on my Wi-Fi here, so I do apologize. So the debrief. What is my golden rule for the debrief? My first rule is always do a debrief. You cannot say we'll do this tomorrow. You cannot say, oh, we nearly made it, or don't worry about that. That was a complete failure. Let's forget about it and start again. Always debrief. If you're not debriefing, you're not learning. And that could be a small little moment for 5 minutes over a coffee. But if you do not debrief, you cannot affect change. Second point, always find a dedicated debriefing space in order to carry out your task. Here we are. We've just flown across the Atlantic. We've landed in North America. We just conducted a display to over 15,000 people, and it went very, very well. We could easily have stood up out of our jets, walked off, and got distracted by the world that is around us. How often do you walk out of a meeting and a secretary might say to you, oh, you need to call this person back? Or as you're walking away, your phone will bing and you've got 2 emails come through that say urgent, must require a response in the next half an hour, hour. We have this all the time. Daily life just gets in the way of our processes and we get distracted by it. You must find that space. There we're in the middle of an international airport with everything happening around us. We have sat on the wing and we found that space for a quick debrief. What we would do, I would recommend to other people, is you either have an office space dedicated to debriefing, or you have a culture where people understand that 15 minutes after an event, after a meeting, after a call, that space is factored in so that you can spend that free time and get that free headspace in order to find out what just happened and break it all down and learn from it. That leads me into the three pillars, the three very important pillars that are the foundation of any effective debrief. What happened? What actually just happened? Was the result in line with our objectives? Objectives are a completely different topic in general. As we all know, SMART, so specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. Now, if our objectives were in line with those, what actually happened? Did we do something we meant to do? Did we not? Where did that break down? Secondly, why did that happen? It's all well and good saying, oh, this happened because of that, and we can make excuses, but let's be realistic here. Why did that happen? This is the biggest and most important of the three, in my opinion, because if you don't understand why, we can't affect change. And the third pillar, how do we fix it? As mentioned at the start, it is the definition of insanity to do the same thing twice and expect a different result, but it's also a waste of time, it's a waste of effort, and it's a waste of resource. In the Red Arrows, we would never, ever, ever taxi our aircraft back to the runway had we not debriefed what we had just done. We would not sleep for days if we took off and we made the same mistake again. It's just too expensive, it's too costly, and it ruins our reputation. It's not what we need to be doing. And then once we've broken that all down, we pass on all our lessons identified to all the relevant departments around us. You'll have secretaries, you'll have business partners, you'll have IT consultants, you'll have managers of teams within your corporation. They might then hear these lessons and go, actually, do you know what? That's what's happening here. That's why you failed. You failed because the lessons you're identifying at the top of the tree are happening down here. The reason you weren't there at the right place at the right time is because we didn't get up and make sure that you were in a good place to make it there. We learn together. You never learn in isolation. And finally, you always have time for some form of debrief. What I've just explained is it's the A-level solution. If you do have the time, you do have the space, and you do have the facilities to make it happen, you can. But let's not forget, when I did it, I was in an aircraft that would fly. Sometimes we'd be in 7 different countries in a day on a busy day. We always found the time to debrief. Even if it just meant we spent 5 minutes saying, how do you think that went? Why was it that you were in that position? Why do you think it went wrong? How are we going to fix that next time? That's it. You could fire questions that quickly, get 3 different answers, and you'll have already learned. Always find the time. Now, that's easy when you already have a culture to build onto. Culture, as we know, comes from having set, clear, defined values. And if you have defined values, clearly, that's going to mean that you will have behaviors in order to uphold your values. And if you have behaviors, you start to create a culture. Now, we believed in the debriefing culture. We live for it. But there's some certain things you need to be able to take on personally in order to do that as a team moving forward. The first is the hardest, and it took me a long time to take on board. You have to be able to accept personal failure. You can change the word failure if you want it to be a softer approach, but it's what I use. I'm quite harsh myself. For me, everything in life is a 1 and a 0. It's a pass or a fail. You have to be able to accept it. If you cannot accept failure, you will not learn. Now, failure, unfortunately, in society has a negative connotation. Failure is one of the best things that can happen in your life. And that's coming from someone who failed to get in the Air Force initially. That's someone who failed to get on the Top Gun school initially. That's someone who failed on the highest possible level by shooting down a friendly aircraft, albeit with a simulated missile on a big exercise in front of the best fighter pilots in the world. And it's someone who failed to get to the Red Arrows a number of times before eventually becoming an executive officer and taking them all around the world. If you're in a team, you need to understand team ethos over individual goals. That's not to say you shouldn't be striving for the best person you can be within yourself. That's not saying you shouldn't strive to have the best career that you can have and go up through the ranks. But in the team you're in, you need to understand team ethos, and you need to be making yourself a better person for that team, continually striving to improve yourself for the greater good of the team around you. Clearly, we need respect for each other. And if you can, having humility will stand you in the highest stead ever in a debriefing process. Being able to smile, understand, and move on from a point that you have made or a failure that you have made publicly is the only way in which you can learn and move forward with no hanging on to the past and dragging those negative points forward with you. So how do we do business? Just a quick insight into how we did it at the Red Arrows. We had a flow. We started at the beginning and we went through the very end, and we didn't skip forward until that point had been made. What happened in the brief? I do apologize. What happened in the plan? Which is probably where we all want to start. When we sit down, we set plans, we set aims, we set objectives. Was there anything in the plan that went wrong that then affected the brief, that then affected the execution, and now we're here in the debrief? So start in a flow, start at the beginning and work to the end. Don't jump around so that people can stay in a flow state as they get from start to the end. We never use names. Now, by that, it took out the pride in someone's work. It took out that negative connotation of a personal attack. So it would never be, Dan, that was rubbish. It would be, but they actually said, number 9, that was rubbish. So find a way within your team that you can depersonalize the points you're trying to get across. It might not work for you to have a position. You might not be able to say your second chair from the left, but have a way maybe that you can take names of your team members, put it into the role that they have within that team, and debrief the role. And you'll find that people will open their ears a lot more. They won't be offended by the negative connotations, and you will instantly find a massive, massive improvement in their personal output. Half error technique. Never try and fix the problem in its entirety. It would be lovely if we could, but it's not going to happen. So only ever set your goal to halve the error at any point. And before you know it, you'll be zeroing in on the target. And eventually you'll be hitting the target time after time after time. If I may use the golf analogy again, you've just played a poor shot. If you're then going to try and overdo the next shot to make up for your error, I can tell you now it's going to go wrong. Just keep it simple. Only try and halve every error, and before you know it, you'll be hitting the target. We all work for big companies, we all have big projects, and we all have a lot of things to do. If we go around our day, we drove to the supermarket today, I can tell you now, I probably sped, I probably had a poor gear change, I probably didn't indicate in time for a junction, although I did eventually, and maybe I got slightly distracted by changing the music. However, if you were actually to sit down with an instructor, there was probably about 20 to 30 errors in my driving technique, which is embarrassing, but true. But I'm not going to fix all of those on the next trip. So I need to just work on 3. Take 3 points that you can make that are realistic, that you can change. Because if you try and fix 20 things at once, you'll be swamped, you'll be overcome with what you need to do, and you'll just forget it. And before you know it, you're exactly where you were at the beginning. Just take 3 points away that you're going to work on and improve on the next time. And summarize at the end. And before you do that, give everyone an opportunity to give you an understanding of the position they were in at the time. I'll give you an example here. I'm talking to you, but let's say you've sat there and gone, right, that wasn't how I would expect it to be. Whereas if I then, as I say, tell you that I'm in Cape Town, you may say, actually, that's a good effort considering you're there. Or I might finish a show and be livid with someone who was supposed to be 4 feet off my wing at 500 miles an hour, but instead they've eroded that safety margin to 3 feet. But actually, it turns out their radio wasn't working. And therefore, the fact that they stayed there for the entirety of that time shows you that they did an excellent job. Give people the opportunity to explain their working environment before you then start to debrief their actual performance. Additionally, honesty, respect, integrity. Have those fundamental factors at the bottom of your debrief culture, respect them, and your culture will be successful. But understand that the second those are destroyed, that whole culture needs to be built again. And that takes years and years and years. Now, back to that missile that impacted the side of my friend's aircraft, and that would have left them in the hands of the enemy 20, 30,000 feet below us. We sat down that night and we broke it all down. The static communication that was going through our ears, like you do sometimes listening to an AM radio, meant that effective communication had broken down. And actually people saying, don't take the shot, where I heard, take the shot. I also understood that in that moment, in the pitch black, with 30, 40, 50 airplanes flying around me, all baying for blood, that I was in an emotionally heightened state. And if I was honest with myself, I was slightly panicked. So what did I learn? I learned that in that environment, I will react in a certain way. Therefore, I need to understand how that comes across and how that affects my decision-making process. And we also understood that actually, albeit when you're flying at 540 miles an hour, screaming down on a target, if you're not sure, you leave those missiles on your aircraft. You turn away, you run away for 10, 20, 30 miles, regather your thoughts and come back. The point being is, in that moment when you're stressed and pushing for it, there's always time to take a step back, regather your thoughts before you take a step forward and execute what it is you're out there to do. And there were the points we took away from a debrief at that scale. A quote I personally love, especially as I'm only miles away from where that great man used to live.